Two sanctioned powers, one shared blueprint, and nobody in Washington is talking about it. What Russia and Iran built together over the last 3 years is not an alliance in the traditional sense. It is something more dangerous than that. It is a system, a set of interlocking relationships, supply chains, financial workarounds, and battlefield arrangements designed to make both countries harder to isolate, harder to pressure, and harder to defeat. And while Western capitals were focused on sanctions and the performance of outrage, these two governments were quietly building habits of cooperation that are now load-bearing walls in a new global architecture. In the next few minutes, I am going to show you exactly what that blueprint looks like, why it is more sophisticated than most people realize, why the Trump administration's approach has made it stronger, not weaker, and why this is not just a story about Russia or Iran. It is a story about the world your children are going to inherit, because the structure being built right now, quietly, without a single dramatic press conference, is going to outlast every news cycle covering it. Hold that thought. Because here is the question I want you sitting with. What is more threatening? Two enemies attacking you directly, or two enemies who have figured out how to make each other unbeatable while you fight them separately? Drop your answer in the comments. Because what Moscow and Tehran just demonstrated is the answer to that question written in real time. Let me take you back to where this actually started. When Trump entered office the first time, he arrived with a theory. Flattery works on autocrats. Personal chemistry can replace institutional diplomacy. Allies are freeloaders who need pressure, not partners who need maintenance. And strongmen can be peeled away from each other through the right combination of compliments and deals. That theory was not just wrong. It was catastrophically, structurally wrong in ways we are still paying for today. Because while Trump was performing dominance, treating NATO like a protection racket, and publicly questioning collective defense guarantees, Moscow and Tehran were not sitting still. They were studying the gaps. They were mapping the vulnerabilities. They were building inside the spaces that American dysfunction was creating, with remarkable patience and precision. That is the miscalculation at the center of everything that follows. Trump assumed pressure was enough, but strategy is not theater. Strategy is position. It is logistics. It is institutions. It is who can keep functioning when the cameras move on. Receipt number one, the war pipeline that changed everything. What exactly happened? After Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the relationship between Moscow and Tehran shifted from diplomatic alignment into something far more concrete. Western governments documented Iran supplying Russia with Shahed series drones that appeared on Ukrainian battlefields. Then came reports of Russia moving toward domestic production tied to Iranian designs and know-how. Then came deeper cooperation on military technology, financial architecture, and sanctions evasion mechanisms. The official language always sounds sterile. Military technical cooperation, regional consultation. Translated into plain English, it means two heavily sanctioned powers learned how to sustain each other under maximum external pressure. Drones, production know-how, financial workarounds, shadow fleet shipping, technology transfers structured to evade detection. Once a relationship shifts from polite diplomacy into wartime utility, it becomes leverage. It becomes infrastructure. And infrastructure does not disappear when the political weather changes. Here is the punchline most analysts are missing. Moscow was not building trust with Tehran. It was building optionality. The fantasy that Putin can be peeled away from Iran through personal chemistry ignores how the Kremlin actually operates. It banks pressure points. It accumulates leverage. It does not surrender those assets for compliments. Every drone that flew over Ukraine carrying Iranian engineering was another brick in a wall that now exists regardless of what any diplomat says in any meeting room. Receipt number two, the NATO and Ukraine wedge engineered from outside and handed a hammer from inside. What exactly happened? Trump did not just criticize NATO allies for defense spending shortfalls. He made the core guarantee of collective defense sound conditional and personally dependent on whether he liked a particular leader on a particular day. He said out loud that he would encourage Russian aggression against NATO members he considered delinquent on spending. Congressional Republicans aligned with his movement delayed critical Ukraine aid for months, while Trump publicly flirted with war fatigue narratives and false equivalence between aggressor and defender. Why does that matter? Because once European capitals start genuinely asking whether Washington is still the unquestioned anchor of the alliance, they do not wait for a final collapse to begin hedging. They start building alternatives immediately. More domestic defense spending, more European strategic autonomy, more joint procurement outside American systems, more bilateral relationships that do not route through Washington. Here is the punchline. While Trump was building political grievance inside the alliance, others were building backups outside it. Every speech questioning NATO's value was heard in Moscow as confirmation that the strategy was working. Every delayed Ukraine aid vote was processed in Tehran as evidence that Western unity was softer than it appeared. You do not need to defeat an alliance militarily if you can convince its most powerful member to do the undermining for you. That is a far more efficient use of resources, and it has been working. Receipt number 3. The economic crosswire that hits your wallet whether you follow geopolitics or not. What exactly happened? The combination of Russian energy weaponization, Iran-aligned pressure on Gulf shipping lanes, Houthi Red Sea disruptions, and the broader instability generated by the Moscow-Tehran cooperation framework created persistent pressure on global energy markets and supply chain reliability that fed directly into inflation figures in countries thousands of miles from any battlefield. The official language tends to be reassuring. Temporary disruptions, manageable risk. In plain language, when the Strait of Hormuz gets tense, tanker insurance rates move immediately. When Red Sea shipping gets disrupted, container costs spike. When container costs spike, every good that moves by ship gets more expensive. When energy prices move, fertilizer gets more expensive. Food production costs rise. Your grocery bill rises. When inflation expectations move upward, central banks delay rate cuts. Mortgages stay painful. Credit card balances stay expensive. Small businesses feel it in payroll. Families feel it every week. That is the crosswire. Ukraine talks to energy. Energy talks to inflation. Inflation talks to elections. Iran talks to shipping. Shipping talks to alliance cohesion. It is cold. It is patient. It is designed, and it is working precisely because most people see each element in isolation rather than as components of a single integrated pressure system. This is the moment I need to speak directly to you, not to analysts, to you specifically. If you run a small business, this is your story. If you manage household finances, this is your story. If you work in manufacturing, logistics, agriculture, energy, or any sector connected to global supply chains, this is already inside your cost structure, whether you can see the mechanism or not. The Russia-Iran cooperation framework is not an abstraction. It is a pressure system with transmission channels running directly into the prices you pay and the rates you borrow at. And here is the structural consequence almost nobody is discussing. Once companies reroute supply chains around new risk realities, once energy buyers diversify sourcing structures, once investors build new assumptions about Western alliance reliability into long-term capital decisions, those changes do not automatically reverse when political temperatures cool. The contracts follow the new routes, the investment follows the new routes, the jobs follow, and they do not come back simply because a different face appears in the White House. This is not a temporary disruption. This is a restructuring event, and restructuring events do not reset. So where does this go? 3 realistic paths. None return to the world that existed before this blueprint was laid down. Scenario 1 is managed containment. Western pressure and Ukrainian battlefield resilience force a slowdown. The blueprint stalls rather than advances. Shipping lanes stabilize. Ukraine support continues in some meaningful form. But even in this best case, the structural shifts already made remain. The drone knowledge is transferred. The financial workarounds are established. The habits of cooperation are built. The blueprint exists and can be reactivated faster than it was originally constructed. Scenario 2 is deepening integration. Russia and Iran formalize what is currently a practical working relationship into something more explicitly structural. More sanctioned countries find ways to plug into the network. A parallel financial architecture operating outside dollar-denominated systems gains enough critical mass to start affecting global pricing in ways that cannot be easily reversed. Military power and systemic financial influence are not the same instrument. The gap between those two things is exactly where the blueprint is being built. Scenario 3 is the one nobody names publicly. Multiple simultaneous pressure points activate at once. A major Ukraine escalation coinciding with serious Gulf instability, coinciding with significant domestic dysfunction in Washington. Markets do not move gradually in that scenario. They move in jumps. Decisions made in crisis tend to be worse than decisions made with preparation. And preparation requires exactly the kind of sustained institutional attention that has been systematically degraded over the period this blueprint was being constructed. Here is the final frame. Whatever happens in the coming months, the relationship between American power, European confidence, Russian strategic patience, and Iranian geographic leverage has already changed. The lesson has been learned by every mid-sized power watching from a careful distance. You do not put all your strategic eggs in one basket, especially not a basket managed by someone who mistakes the performance of strength for the construction of it. Russia and Iran did not create every pressure point on this board, but they have shown remarkable discipline in exploiting every mistake the other side keeps making, not with superior firepower, not with larger economies, with patience, with systems thinking, with the cold strategic clarity to let an impulsive adversary keep handing them tools and then use those tools to build something permanent. Did Russia and Iran build something genuinely new, or did Washington hand them the blueprints through its own dysfunction? Is Europe's move towards strategic autonomy a betrayal of the alliance or the only rational response to what has happened to it? And when the history of this period is finally written, will it say that the Western order was dismantled by its enemies or handed to them one unforced error at a time? Drop your answers below. I read every single one. Subscribe now, because the next chapter, NATO emergency session, new Ukraine negotiations, Gulf escalation, or the market shock hitting your mortgage rate before it hits the front page, is already in motion. This story is not slowing down. Do not look away.